What would it take for the ground you're standing on to simply give up and collapse into a lake overnight? And why is that already happening across the Arctic almost every summer? The answer isn't a sinkhole story or a freak accident. It's the visible edge of something that has been building underground for thousands of years and is only now waking up. Picture the Arctic not as empty white wilderness, but as a giant frozen pantry, packed floor to ceiling with roots, moss, animal remains, and old plant matter that never finished rotting. Cold did what refrigerators do for leftovers. It paused the decay before bacteria and fungi could get through their meal, sealing an entire era of dead life into the soil itself. That pantry is now thawing, and the microbes that once shared this land with mammoths and ancient forests are getting a second invitation to finish what they started. People call this the Arctic's biological time bomb, though the image of one dramatic explosion is misleading. There's no single fuse, no countdown clock ticking toward one moment. The real danger is spread across millions of square kilometers, quietly triggered by heat, water, fire, and microbial appetite, then leaking out through thousands of small, unremarkable openings. A bubbling pond here, a blackened hillside there, a road that sags a little more each year. None of it looks catastrophic on its own, yet together these small leaks can nudge the entire planet's chemistry. To understand where this is heading, you first need to know what permafrost actually is, not just frozen dirt, but any ground that has stayed below freezing for at least 2 years running. In much of the Arctic, that streak has lasted far longer than 2 years. Some of this soil has been frozen since ecosystems existed that no longer have a name we'd recognize. Sitting above all that ancient ground is a thin, active layer, a strip of soil that thaws every summer and refreezes every winter, giving plants just enough of a foothold to survive. As summers stretch longer and hotter, that thin working layer pushes deeper into the earth, reaching material that hasn't touched liquid water since long before recorded history. Thawing alone doesn't turn ancient carbon into greenhouse gas. Dead plant matter can sit there defrosted for a while before anything happens, because carbon needs a living process to send it back into the sky. That living process is microbial. Bacteria wake up, latch onto old organic matter, break it down piece by piece, and breathe out carbon dioxide as a byproduct, exactly the way you exhale after digesting a meal. In wetter ground, where oxygen struggles to reach, a different crew of microbes takes over, and instead of carbon dioxide, they produce methane, a gas built for trapping heat rather than lingering for centuries. Methane doesn't stay in the atmosphere nearly as long as carbon dioxide, but while it's up there, it grabs far more heat, which makes the balance between these two gases matter enormously. Whether a patch of thawed ground leans toward dry decay or wet fermentation depends on drainage, vegetation, fire history, and simple luck. A mix so tangled it keeps climate scientists up at night. That unpredictability makes precise modeling brutally difficult, but it doesn't leave any real doubt about which direction the feedback runs. Warming from human emissions thaws more frozen ground. Thawed ground feeds hungry microbes. Those microbes exhale more greenhouse gas, and that gas adds another layer of warming on top of what we already caused. It's a feedback loop powered entirely by metabolism, by organisms too small to see, quietly working through a carbon reservoir large enough to shift the planet's temperature. Just how large is worth sitting with for a second. The carbon locked in northern permafrost is estimated at roughly double everything currently floating in Earth's atmosphere. That number doesn't mean the whole vault is about to empty out at once. The real concern is smaller but still serious, an extra tap opening into a carbon budget that's already stretched thin. We usually talk about climate targets as if humanity holds the only dial, but permafrost hands the planet a second dial, one that turns on its own in response to the warming we've already produced. And once microbes have converted that ancient carbon into gas, no policy or promise can coax it back underground. Cutting emissions today can't unrelease what's already left the soil. That gives this process a long memory. Some consequences will keep unfolding for decades after global temperatures level off, simply because deep soils and slow ecosystems take their time catching up. Making matters worse, the Arctic isn't warming at the same pace as the rest of the planet. It's warming considerably faster, largely because of what happens to sunlight up there. Bright snow and sea ice normally act like a mirror, bouncing solar energy straight back into space before it can do any damage. Strip that mirror away, and darker ocean water, bare soil, and exposed vegetation start absorbing the sun instead of reflecting it, which lets the region heat itself on top of whatever warming arrives from elsewhere. Add in moisture-heavy air-changing cloud cover and snowfall patterns, plus extra heat ferried north by both atmosphere and ocean currents, and you get a place stuck in its own private amplifier. Since satellite records began in the late 1970s, this region has warmed at close to 4 times the global average, which places the planet's largest carbon vault inside its most overheated neighborhood. Thaw rarely arrives as a gentle, even softening from the surface downward, because much of this ground isn't simple dirt. It's soil cemented together by buried ice acting like structural glue. When that hidden ice finally melts, the ground above it has nothing left holding it up, so instead of thawing slowly, it can buckle, slump, or collapse within days. This kind of sudden failure creates a landscape scientists call thermokarst, where hillsides tear open and once flat tundra turns into a maze of new ponds, drainage channels, and sinking hollows. A slow, tidy model of permafrost thaw imagines centimeters disappearing each summer, but a single collapsing riverbank can expose several meters of ancient, untouched ground to warmth and water almost overnight. Meltwater usually pools inside these fresh depressions, and standing water starved of oxygen is exactly the environment methane-producing microbes have been waiting for. From a drone shot, one of these new lakes can look almost peaceful, its surface occasionally interrupted by bubbles carrying up carbon that was sealed away long before anyone built a city. Come winter, some of those bubbles get trapped mid-rise, frozen into pale disks and columns just beneath the ice, a strange, beautiful signature of a microbial engine still running underneath. When spring cracks the ice open again, the trapped gas finally escapes into open air, and this single lake becomes one small contributor among thousands doing the exact same thing across the Arctic. Not every thermokarst lake sticks around, either. Some drain out suddenly, leaving behind exposed, drying sediment that shifts the emissions balance back toward carbon dioxide instead of methane. The landscape essentially keeps switching which gas it prefers to emit, flipping between wet and dry pathways as water restlessly moves through ground that no longer holds its shape. Fire adds an entirely different kind of acceleration, particularly across boreal forests and tundra, where a spongy layer of moss and organic soil usually works as natural insulation over the permafrost below. Burn that insulating layer away, and sunlight and warm air suddenly reach deeper into ground that was previously shielded, while the blackened, ash-covered surface starts soaking up even more heat. A wildfire also releases a quick burst of carbon from the living plants it consumes, then leaves the older, frozen carbon underneath exposed to years of extra thaw and microbial attack afterward. That means a single fire can trigger 2 separate emissions events, one immediate pulse visible as smoke, and a second, slower pulse that keeps rising from damaged soil long after the flames are out. Fires have always been part of these northern landscapes, but hotter conditions, longer fire seasons, and drier vegetation are making extreme, fast-moving burns noticeably more common. In some regions, it isn't just surface vegetation that burns. The peat itself catches fire, letting flames smolder downward through carbon that took centuries to accumulate. These underground fires can survive being buried under snow, quietly holding onto heat and embers through an entire winter before flaring back up again once spring arrives. The result is a feedback tucked inside another feedback. Warming encourages fire. Fire strips away permafrost protection, thaw releases carbon, and that carbon adds yet more warming to the cycle. Plants complicate this story in an unexpected way, because a warmer Arctic is also, in many places, becoming visibly greener, with shrubs spreading and growing seasons stretching longer each year. Through photosynthesis, all that new vegetation pulls carbon dioxide out of the air, raising a tempting idea. Maybe growth could quietly cancel out decay. During peak summer, some tundra ecosystems really are absorbing more carbon than before, thanks to extra warmth and extended daylight fueling stronger plant growth. The catch shows up once you count the entire year rather than just the sunny months, because autumn and winter bring a season where plants slow to a crawl but microbes underneath the snow keep working. Snow feels bitterly cold on top, yet a thick enough layer behaves like a blanket, trapping just enough warmth in the soil below to keep microbial respiration going through total darkness. All that carbon a landscape absorbed under bright summer sun can quietly leak back out over the long, cold months, sometimes wiping out the entire seasonal gain by the time spring returns. Recent field measurements suggest that rising respiration and more frequent wildfire have already pushed parts of the tundra from being a modest carbon sink into becoming a net carbon dioxide source. Greening, in other words, isn't the simple rescue story it first appears to be, because new shrubs also reshape snow depth, surface color, soil temperature, and how easily fire spreads. Taller shrubs trap more snow around their base through winter, which protects roots from brutal cold snaps, but can also keep the ground underneath noticeably warmer than bare tundra would be. Dark shrub branches poking above the snowline soak up sunlight that a flat, white surface would have simply bounced away, adding one more small push to the region's overall warming. Elsewhere, the opposite happens. Vegetation shades the soil and actually helps preserve permafrost, a useful reminder that the same biological shift can push outcomes in opposite directions depending on local conditions. Put together, the Arctic's so-called time bomb isn't one substance or one chemical reaction. It's a tangled network of parts that can either reinforce each other or quietly cancel each other out. Water sits at the center of most of these outcomes, and thawing permafrost has a way of rearranging it with surprising force. Frozen ground normally works like a sealed floor, stopping meltwater from draining away and helping form the wetlands, ponds, and shallow lakes scattered across the Arctic landscape. Once that floor cracks, one patch of ground can turn into a swamp while another, sitting just meters away, dries out completely. The same thaw producing two opposite results side by side. Wet ground tends to favor methane, dry ground tends to favor carbon dioxide and fire, and either way, ancient carbon finds a path back into the atmosphere. Rivers carry dissolved organic matter away from collapsing banks, giving sunlight and microbes downstream a fresh chance to break it down before it ever reaches open ocean. Coastal erosion opens up yet another route, as Arctic shorelines retreat and expose long-frozen sediment directly to crashing waves, oxygen, and seawater that's warmer than it used to be. It genuinely doesn't matter to the carbon itself whether it gets processed in soil, a lake, a river, or the ocean. The only thing that matters is whether it stays buried or rejoins circulation. All this shifting water also drags along nutrients and metals, capable of reshaping ecosystems far beyond wherever the original thaw actually happened. Nitrogen and phosphorus pulled out of thawed soil can fertilize nearby plants and microbes, sometimes boosting carbon uptake and sometimes simply speeding up decomposition instead. Mercury that's been locked in frozen ground for millennia can wash into waterways, where chemical and biological processes convert it into forms that build up steadily through the food chain. None of this stays abstract for long, because permafrost isn't just a wilderness layer, it's the literal foundation underneath homes, roads, pipelines, and airstrips across the Arctic. When ice-rich ground thaws out from under a structure, a building can tilt sideways, a road can crack open, and a fuel line can lose the stable footing its engineers assumed would last. The same collapsing terrain can wreck hunting trails, contaminate freshwater sources, and even uncover old waste sites or burial grounds that were never meant to see daylight again. Long before any global temperature graph fully registers this feedback, people living across the north are already experiencing it firsthand as broken roads and a landscape that keeps rearranging itself. The headlines people find most alarming usually involve biology directly, specifically, the idea that thawing ground might release pathogens that have been sleeping for thousands of years. Permafrost really does hold a huge variety of ancient microbes and viral genetic material, and some especially tough spores, like those behind anthrax, can survive frozen for a remarkably long time. In 2016, an anthrax outbreak among Siberian reindeer was linked to unusually warm conditions that likely exposed the carcass of an animal that had been frozen for decades. Still, the idea of some prehistoric supervirus clawing its way out of the ice is far shakier ground than the carbon feedback we can already measure across Arctic ecosystems today. Most ancient microbes would face an obstacle course almost impossible to clear: damaged cells, no compatible host, ultraviolet light, oxygen exposure, competition from modern organisms, and an environment nothing like the one they evolved in. The more credible health concern is less cinematic but far more likely. Thaw disturbing already, known pathogens, old contaminated sites, decades-old animal remains, and microbes carrying resistance genes we'd rather not encounter. Warming is also letting modern diseases, parasites, insects, and entire species migrate north, creating new biological encounters that don't require anything ancient waking up at all. In that sense, whatever health risk the Arctic poses comes just as much from life arriving fresh from the south as it does from anything released out of the deep past. The ocean surrounding the Arctic is going through its own quiet reorganization as sea ice retreats, water warms, and sunlight reaches places that used to stay covered for most of the year. Microscopic algae are blooming earlier, or in entirely different locations than before, which changes exactly when and where energy first enters the marine food web. Fish shift their range following temperature and prey, while seabirds, seals, and whales are forced to adjust to routes and seasons that no longer match the ones they evolved around. Some waters are seeing genuinely more biological productivity, but more life doesn't automatically mean a stable ecosystem, especially once the timing between predators and their food starts drifting apart. A plankton bloom that peaks before young fish are even ready to eat is a bit like a feast arriving at a table nobody's sitting at yet. As species from farther south push northward, they bring new competitors and parasites into communities that spent thousands of years adapted specifically to cold and stable sea ice. Cold specialist Arctic species keep losing ground while generalists move in and thrive, leaving an ecosystem that feels busier on the surface but noticeably less distinctly Arctic underneath. None of these ocean shifts create the same direct carbon feedback that thawing soil does, but they point to the same larger pattern. Living systems everywhere up north are falling out of sync with each other. The phrase time bomb naturally makes people search for a countdown, some single dramatic threshold after which the Arctic supposedly becomes unstoppable no matter what anyone does. The science paints a less cinematic but much more useful picture. Permafrost emissions tend to scale steadily with how much and how long warming continues, rather than waiting around for one universal trigger to flip. Sudden local collapses absolutely happen, and some of the damage may genuinely be irreversible for centuries, but there's no single giant switch governing the entire Arctic at once. That also means there's no precise year when this bomb finally detonates, and just as importantly, no safe cutoff point after which further action stops mattering. Every extra fraction of warming thaws a bit more ground, deepens fire seasons, speeds up decomposition, and pushes a larger share of buried carbon out into open air. Run that same logic in reverse, and every fraction of warming avoided keeps more organic matter locked in frozen soil and keeps the whole feedback a little weaker. That's exactly why permafrost carbon shouldn't be treated as an excuse to give up, as though nature has somehow already taken the decision out of human hands. Humanity still controls the dominant source of today's warming through fossil fuels, land use, and the rest of industrial emissions. That part of the equation hasn't changed. What the Arctic feedback really does is raise the stakes on those choices, because continued warming keeps recruiting more of the natural world into amplifying what we started. Cutting emissions now won't undo a hillside that's already collapsed, but it absolutely can limit how many more hillsides go the same way, and how much ancient carbon ever gets the chance to reach hungry microbes in the first place. Climate models are finally catching up to this reality too, gradually incorporating permafrost processes that older projections either simplified heavily or left out completely. Satellites now track surface collapse from orbit, aircraft measure methane plumes drifting overhead, ground towers log carbon exchange around the clock, and field teams sample gas by hand through every season of the year. No single one of these tools tells the whole story on its own. A short summer field campaign can easily miss a whole season of winter respiration, and a satellite pass can't see what's happening meters underground. Researchers stitch all of it together across wildly different scales, from the genetics inside individual microbial cells up to atmospheric patterns stretching across entire continents. What's genuinely still uncertain is how much carbon will emerge, how fast, and in what form. Not whether widespread thaw is already adding extra emissions, because that part is settled. Those remaining details matter enormously, since a slow trickle of carbon dioxide and a sudden pulse of methane would shape near-term warming in very different ways. They also decide how much breathing room is actually left in the human carbon budgets built around specific global temperature targets. If permafrost turns out to be releasing more than current estimates assume, societies will simply need to cut their own emissions further to hit the exact same climate goal. Local fixes do exist, protecting infrastructure, managing fire risk, restoring damaged ground. But no engineering project on Earth is going to refreeze the entire circumpolar North. Some experimental ideas involve grazing animals, deliberate vegetation management, or altering snow cover to keep certain soils colder, though their real-world effects stay regional and genuinely uncertain. The only strategy powerful enough to limit this threat across the whole Arctic at once is reducing the warming that keeps activating it in the first place. Even then, the response won't be immediate, because oceans, ice, soil, and entire ecosystems carry enormous momentum from heat they've already absorbed and haven't finished responding to yet. There's an uncomfortable lesson buried in all of this. Climate consequences don't always arrive wearing the recognizable shape of a smokestack or an engine. Sometimes they show up as quiet respiration rising from waterlogged soil, as invisible microbes finally finishing meals that got interrupted back at the end of the last ice age. A single gram of ancient root becomes carbon dioxide, a flooded hollow becomes a methane source, a wildfire tears open the ground, and a river hauls the leftover products downstream toward the sea. Every one of those steps is ordinary biology on its own, yet the sheer scale and timing of it happening everywhere at once is what makes the combined effect extraordinary. For thousands of years, cold kept decomposition permanently unfinished, letting the remains of entire vanished ecosystems quietly pile up underneath a living, breathing surface layer. Industrial-era warming is now rewriting the rules of that preservation faster than many Arctic landscapes have any real chance of adapting to. What used to function as a long-term carbon vault is turning into an active carbon source, and ground that stood solid for millennia is turning into moving, unpredictable water. The danger was never hidden because scientists lacked the tools to see it. It's hidden because it almost never looks like a catastrophe while it's actually unfolding. It looks like slightly greener shrubs, a summer that runs a bit longer than last year's, a lake sitting where there used to be solid ground, or bubbles frozen mid-rise beneath a sheet of perfectly clear ice. Only once you connect all these separate, quiet scenes together does the full mechanism come into focus. Warming is slowly turning a frozen archive of ancient life back into an active player in Earth's climate. The Arctic's biological time bomb, in the end, looks less like a device waiting for one final spark and more like a vast, slow engine that keeps finding new fuel to burn. Its fuel is ancient carbon. Its moving parts are water, fire, plants, and microbes, and its throttle is simply the planet's rising temperature. We may never hear anything resembling an explosion, but the quiet hiss of gas escaping from thawing ground could end up shaping the climate for generations still to come.